My name is Anwar Iman. I'm the director of the Institute of Islamic Studies at the University of Toronto, and it's my pleasure to introduce this second webinar series of our newly launched project, the Muslims in Canada Data Initiative. Just a brief background for those of you who weren't with us last week. MiCDI, as we call it for short, is a data initiative that began through consultations with community partners, academics, and institutions about 3 years ago in 2018 when I first began as director of the Institute. And it became very clear, and particularly through consultations with our panelists here, who I had the pleasure of consulting back then, that there is a data gap, or it's a gap in the data and its representativeness of Muslims in Canada, and that gap has serious implications for effective, democratic, accountable decision-making and policies as they relate not just only to Muslims, but a number of different indicia of diversity metrics that, that Muslims lie at the intersection of. And so in working with a number of organizations and a number of community partners, we decided to come together to develop this project. We're really delighted to have on this project a number of groups, and Veronix, the Institute, University of Calgary, Black Muslim Initiative, CCMW, the Inspirit Foundation, the National Council of Canadian Muslims, NCCM, the Tesla Institute, the Canadian Muslim Vote. We're also really pleased to have new organizations to join us like MAC and the Olive Tree Foundation. These organizations and others are coming together with us to try to see if we can make MiCDI a reality. MiCDI as a data initiative is an attempt to both create data and, of course, analyze data, and think about how we might center the Muslim in this data analysis for purposes of storytelling, analysis, policy development, and so on. What's important about MiCDI is, of course, is that as a launch, it's an initiative, but it does require your support. Our aim is to try to develop through a fundraising project, a project that speaks to both academic and community interests, that's nicely calibrated between academic excellence and community-based interests around advocacy for Muslims in Canada. And so for that reason, we're coming to many organizations within the larger Muslim community spectrum, many of who would be beneficiaries of the data project. And we're looking for your support. The idea then is through support from the Muslim communities, we can better calibrate it to their needs. We can coordinate survey analysis and survey development in light of certain thematic focal points that are important to them. And so that's our goal in this. Our aim, just so that you know a little bit about the project and where we are. We're doing the launch here in 2021. You'll be meeting our data team in just a few minutes, two of whom will lead the discussion today. But we begin with this web series. We begin a series of educational seminars that we hope to use to enhance data literacy across both the academic spectrum, but also community organizational spectra. We plan to start developing a survey that would be implemented through Veronix. And the idea would be to work with our community partners and International Advisory Board to design what that survey would look like, what the big themes are, how we might both integrate previous survey data with recent ones, where the idea then, of course, is also to integrate an Veronix-based survey with the 2021 census that's currently being implemented by StatCan. This is the year StatCan is asking the religion question. As my colleagues will tell you, this is not often asked every 5 years. This is asked every 10 years. And so the most recent data we have on Muslims is from 2011 here in Canada, and you can imagine how outdated that data becomes. The aim of this project is to showcase the significance of this sort of data, this sort of focus on religion, in the hopes that in asking the religion question more regularly, we have the ability to track a variety of indicia of a variety of factors that affect Muslims, but not just Muslims, Muslims as a category of people who also sit at the intersection of race, economics, housing, education, and so on and so forth. The hope then is by 2022, implementing the survey, developing, coordinating it with StatCan raw data, and then following up with a series of thematic papers that we would host here at the Institute under the auspices of MiCDI. So whereas in the past, we would have a survey and we would have these wonderful reports produced by Environics, our hope is to have that, but then also contribute to other thematic research that builds upon Environics data, builds upon StatCan data through a data team that directs a series of postdocs and graduate students around key topics that calibrate academic interests with community-based interests as well. So these are the basic ideas. We're looking for support, and if this is of interest to you, we hope you'll reach out to me. You can reach me at the Institute. But with that, but today's session is really about enhancing data literacy and taking you the next step from our last seminar. Which was last week, we had Abdie Kazemipur and Sarah Shaw speak to you about the state of affairs around data and Muslim demographics in Canada. Today, we're going to have Sarah Shaw continue leading off today's seminar. Sarah is a postdoctoral research fellow here at the Institute of Islamic Studies. She also is a professor at the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto in the Mississauga campus and a research consultant for Canadian Muslim community organizations. After Sarah will be Keith Newman, and Sarah will give Keith a proper introduction, but Keith's been a member of our data team for years. He's been advising me on a number of fronts. He's a senior associate with the Environics Institute for Survey Research. I'll leave the rest of his introduction for Sarah to do, but it's a real pleasure to have both of them inaugurate this second webinar series, and all of which, of course, is recorded. So right now we are recording, and the final recording will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. So if you know people who wanted to be here but couldn't, I hope you'll share that with them. So with that, let me once again welcome you to our MiCDI webinar and turn it over to Sarah.
Thank you, Enver. I'm just going to, I'm so sorry about my birds. Okay, you should be able to see my slides now. Thank you all for joining us today for the second webinar of the series. Just a quick recap of last week's webinar. Dr. Kazemipur and I spoke about two kinds of data that help us gain a better understanding of the experience and outcomes of Muslims in Canada and other immigrant contexts as well. For those that missed the first webinar, you can watch the recording on the Institute's YouTube channel. And that will be, the link for that will be sent out following this webinar. At the last webinar, many of you expressed interest in gaining a better understanding of Canadian Muslim experiences of Islamophobia. And so today, Dr. Newman and I will focus on the perspectives and experiences of Muslims, as well as non-Muslim attitudes about Muslims and Islam. Both of these measures help us understand the incidence and the prevalence of Islamophobia, as well as additional questions that we may have about Muslims in Canada, from their life experiences, their goals and aspirations, their religious practices, and the importance and frequency of those practices. Before we turn to the Canadian context, though, let's see what kinds of data sets are available in other immigrant receiving countries. Drawing on the kinds of research or general questions we have about Canadian Muslims, we can focus on the kinds of survey questions researchers have asked Muslims and non-Muslims in other immigrant contexts. Here's a short list of data sets available in non-Canadian countries, which, like Canada, receive large numbers of immigrant Muslims. But unlike Canada, these countries have multiple data sets to better understand the experiences of Muslims, as well as attitudes about Muslims. Today, we'll focus specifically on the British, Australian, and global contexts. So let's first look at the UK. Let's dig deeper to see what kinds of questions researchers ask to understand the Muslim sense of belonging and experiences in the UK, and then we'll turn to non-Muslim British attitudes towards Muslims and Islam. One way that researchers try to understand how groups feel about their social and local contexts is by asking how respondents feel about their local areas of residence. Here, the data are broken down so we can compare British Muslims, Christians, and all respondents in the UK. Compared to Christians, British Muslims are more likely to report that their areas have gotten better, while Christians are more likely to report that their areas have not changed. Another finding from this graph is that Muslims were more than twice as likely to report that they've lived in their area for less than 2 years, indicating that Muslims either experience more residential mobility and instability than Christians, so they move around more, or it might also indicate that there are more new immigrants who are Muslim compared to Christian, or it might be a combination of these two factors. Another way that researchers try to understand how groups identify socially is to ask what they consider their national identity. In this graph, only adult Muslims are represented, and we see that nearly 3/4 of all respondents identified as British, and small groups of Muslims identify with other nationalities in this data set. Another social identity question that researchers ask is on important specific aspects and how they relate to respondents' sense of who they are. This table shows several aspects and then breaks them down by the rates the participants report very important aspects. In this table, we can compare British Muslims to Christians as well as Hindus. What we find is that compared to everyone else, Muslims report that their religion is very important at significantly higher rates than others. And this might be a result of experiencing Islamophobia, which we'll get to in a few slides. In addition to social identity, researchers may be interested in asking about civic engagement, like whether or not the respondents vote or if they intend to vote. This question asks how likely respondents will vote in the next general election, and we see that although Muslims are overall a bit less likely to report that they will vote, when we break that down by age categories, we see that Muslims under 55 years old actually report higher likelihood of voting compared to all British respondents. Now let's turn to questions that specifically get at Islamophobia. As I mentioned earlier, there are two types of measuring questions that get at Islamophobia. First, Muslim experiences of discrimination, and second, non-Muslim attitudes about Muslims and Islam. Here we see the responses Muslims provide for specific reasons that they have been discriminated against. Most feel that they were discriminated against because of their ethnicity, race, skin color, or religion, with fewer reporting other forms of discrimination. These are pretty high rates, and yet still, some may dismiss these reports as Muslims being overly sensitive or other reasons to ignore the realities of Muslims experiencing discrimination in the UK. And so this is why it's important to ask non-Muslims how they feel about Muslims and Islam to see how the data speak to each other. This table presents data from 3 separate surveys. In each survey, we see that British non-Muslims report much more unfavorable attitudes towards Muslims compared to other religious groups. For example, in the first data set presented, which is from the Pew Research Center, it shows that the British public reported unfavorable attitudes towards Muslims at 4 times the rate of unfavorable attitudes towards Jews. In addition to these feelings of favorability type questions, researchers also ask respondents to report their sense of how Islam is viewed in the UK. Even though the majority reported that Islam is not a violent religion, or that they believe that Islam is not a violent religion, still, many report that most people in the UK have a negative view of Islam. So even non-Muslim British respondents are able to tap into this general feeling that there is Islamophobia, and this makes it a bit more difficult for people to dismiss Muslim reports of discrimination. Researchers might also ask respondents to indicate how much they agree with certain attitudes comparing Islam and British society. Here again, drawing on 2 different data sets, we find that the majority of respondents feel that there is a clash between Islam and British society, that the two are incompatible. Okay, now let's turn to the Australian context. While many of the questions I've just presented from the British context were also asked in the Australian context, I'm not going to cover those in the interest of showing you additional types of questions that can be asked. The first set focuses on Australian Muslim religiosity, and the second set of questions will focus on non-Muslim Australian attitudes towards Islam and Muslims. One category of religiosity questions that researchers ask is about how strictly or loosely respondents feel about the scriptures, be it the Bible, the Quran, and so forth. This data comes from a survey on Muslim Australians, and so it focuses on the Quran, specifically on several aspects of how they engage or believe about the Quran and what they think about it. These questions range from historical relevance, the weight of scholarly interpretation or tafsir, the value of each and every verse, and so on. These questions can show how nuanced and fine-grained quantitative data can be when we're wanting to know more about Muslim religiosity. One of the values of these questions is that the responses can be tested or related against other questions, like Muslim sense of belonging in different social contexts. We can see how different types of religiosity relate to whether or not Muslims feel like they are welcome or that they belong at school or work or in the wider society more generally. Here are additional religiosity type questions, this time focused on the Sharia. I won't get too into the findings here, but I'd like to just highlight the fact that most Australian Muslims, regardless of their gender, prefer Australian law to Sharia. This kind of data can really help to dispel Islamophobic myths about creeping Sharia, or that immigrant Muslims are wanting to take over their host societies and implement Sharia in lieu of secular law. So let's talk more about Islamophobia now and other ways to measure non-Muslim attitudes about beliefs about Muslims and Islam. Here, non-Muslim Australians are asked how much they agree with certain statements, including whether or not they avoid contact with Muslims, which is really important, as we'll see in a moment. Also, if they would live near Muslims or feel comfortable speaking with Muslims, and so on. This data can be broken down by social categories, for example, by education, which is presented here. It can also be broken down by geographic location, by age, political affiliation, basically any socio-demographic, economic, or other measure included in the survey. And this is important for those who are designing advocacy or education programs to target Islamophobia. So here we see that those with the highest score on the Islamophobia scale are those who did not complete high school. So interventions would be most effective if offered at very early years in grade school, rather than, for example, during university. Here's another way to break down the data, this time looking at Australians who do or don't have regular contact with Muslims. We see that those who do have regular contact have significantly lower scores of Islamophobia than those who do not have regular contact. It's not clear if contact itself is what reduces Islamophobia or if non-Muslims are purposely seeking out contact with Muslims because they do not foster Islamophobic attitudes. In other words, we don't know the cause here. And this is why the measure I mentioned earlier of whether or not non-Muslim Australians avoid contact with Muslims comes into play. We can use the responses on that question to identify how that plays a role in the relationship between contact and lower scores of Islamophobia. There's a lot more we could talk about here, but in the interest of time, let's move on to global surveys. Here, I draw on the US-based Pew Research Center that has become a prime source for social survey data on religion and related items. Drawing on this data, the Pew Center reports that Muslims are expected to be the fastest growing religious group over the next few decades. And I know there's a common belief that this is because of converts, but actually, the data indicates that this is because of how many children Muslims have compared to non-Muslims. Muslims have larger families, and this is true around the world in any context. This was more of a demographic type question, so let's get back into perspectives and experiences, since that's the focus of today's webinar. One of the benefits of having global data sets or data that can be used to compare different countries is the ability to measure similar outcomes across different contexts. So here's a graph and map indicating percents of the respondents in the different European countries who have unfavorable views of Muslim compatriots, so Muslims in their own countries. What we see here is that the further south and east you travel, so towards the Middle East, the more unfavorable views are reported. Perhaps this is the inverse of the expression, distance makes the heart grow fonder. What is striking here is that the UK is actually the country with the lowest unfavorable attitudes. In other words, the most favorable attitudes. In the data I presented earlier, we saw that a sizable majority of British Muslims reported experiencing discrimination. This makes me wonder what the experiences are like for Muslims in Hungary or in Italy. Moving on, global data sets allow us to explore attitudes that the world's Muslims and non-Muslims have towards each other. Here we see Pew data on characteristics that non-immigrant Muslims and Westerners attribute to each other. From this data, it appears that Westerners may have better opinions of Muslims than the other way around. For example, honest was the second most common characteristic that Westerners associated with Muslims. The positive characteristics are least likely to be the ones that Muslims associate with Westerners. So the global data is useful in many ways. However, although many countries are included in Pew's global survey, Canada is not. Despite the fact that Canadian Muslims make up a higher proportion of the population in Canada compared to Muslims in many of these other countries, despite the fact that Canada is hailed around the world as being exceptional in its ability to integrate immigrants. So basically, even though Canada is a really important and interesting case at the global level when considering the experiences of Muslims or non-Muslim attitudes about Muslims, this country is still overlooked. And so the Environics Institute, in collaboration with other organizations, conducted its own survey of Muslims in Canada, breaking ground in 2006 and repeating the survey in 2016. We're fortunate to have Dr. Newman with us, who led both waves of the survey and who I now invite to speak with us about the findings of these important data sets.
So let me begin. Apologize for that delay. I'd like to welcome everybody to the webinar, and I'd like to speak to you about the research that my institute conducted with Muslims in Canada. And the reason we're highlighting this is because it's really only such research that's been done to date. And some of you who are attending the webinar, in fact, may have seen this research or be familiar with it. And if so, you'll get a bit of a refresher course. So as Sarah mentioned, the Pew Research Center does wonderful research. And in 2006, they did a very impressive 15-country survey of Muslims and non-Muslims around the world. And Canada was not included in that survey. And I can tell you from my discussions with my colleagues at Pew, they weren't even considering Canada. It simply was not on their radar. Our institute was a bit surprised with this, with Canada being missing, given the significance of the Muslim population. And we decided to fill this gap and do our own survey of Muslims, modeled closely on the Pew survey to essentially fill in the gap. It was, in fact, the very first project our institute ever conducted in 2006. And it was a good kickoff to our mission to do important social research in this country that no one else seems to be doing. So we did this research. The way we made it happen was through an ongoing Environics research study called Focus Canada. Some of you may have heard about it, to make the research happen. And we partnered with the CBC because we wanted to make sure that the results got a strong public profile rather than just being available to other researchers. Why we did the research is really, I think that question's been answered largely by my colleagues Abdie and Sarah, given the absence of research on Muslims in Canada. Obviously an important population. There are lots of issues and concerns around Muslims in this country from terms of politics and concerns about terrorism and controversies over integration. So it's not simply another immigrant group in this country. But clearly multiculturalism is a very important policy, and so it's important to understand and and help ensure that there is the right kind of inclusiveness and acceptance of all groups. So really, the reason for doing this research was pretty compelling. There's been some mention about the Muslim population in Canada and how it's been growing. I just thought I would show you the numbers, starting from the late 19th century when the first Muslim families arrived in Canada, to 2011, which is where we have the most current accurate count from the census, where we could see there were almost over, at that point, over 1 million Muslims living in this country. We don't yet have another accurate fix. We'll be getting that with the 2021 census. But the best estimates right now is that there will be over 2 million Muslims in this country this year. That means the population has doubled in just a decade and would make it the third largest religious group in the country behind Catholics and Protestants. So really a very significant part of the population by all respects. So we did the research in late 2006. We released it in early 2007 with the CBC. This may be distant history for most of us to remember, but the CBC provided excellent national coverage, TV, radio, and the web. It just so happened that the survey was released about the same time as the TV program Little Mosque on the Prairie, which you may remember. And so the two kind of built on each other, and it was interesting that some of the themes of the TV show were actually reflected in the research, although that was not by design. We were very pleased that the survey research was well received by the Muslim community. It was seen as a positive contribution. And since then, the research has been widely quoted, not just by academics, but the Muslim community and governments and so forth. It's really become sort of the benchmark for understanding the Muslim population that the basic statistics don't capture. So one question that had come up sometimes in response to this research is, well, why do a survey? What does it accomplish? What does it add that nothing else, that other things don't? And we felt that this is a question perhaps that we should answer. So without having a long narrative about this, let me just make a few key points about survey research. It's sometimes doesn't have a great reputation because sometimes people think about political polls and other research that's not all that helpful to society. But survey research is actually a very powerful technology or vehicle that provides an opportunity to amplify the voices of individuals within a given population or group versus a group sort of voice, and helps to bring out narratives that might or may not fit the stereotypes that tend to be circulated. So it really is a form of expression through social science research. Excuse me. When such research is properly conducted, it provides credible empirical evidence about a population, about social facts, that is more broadly accepted than anecdote as a basis for collective action. Anecdotes are very powerful and get a lot of attention, but they don't necessarily accurately reflect the realities on the ground. Another value of this kind of research is that it provides the opportunity to have a better understanding of the diversity of communities and populations, because you can analyze the results by specific groups, whether by age group or national origin and so forth, a way that you cannot do through more qualitative kinds of information. And finally, surveys attract media and public attention, which can be a good thing because it can lead to constructive change. Once we finished the research in 2007, we felt we were done. Our hope was that other organizations, maybe the federal government or a national Muslim organization, might pick up the ball on this and continue this kind of research over time, because obviously it needs to be done on a regular basis. But somehow that didn't happen. So in 2016, our institute decided to do a second survey to build on the first. And we invited a number of organizations to participate as partners with us on this new project. 5 organizations, it included Muslim and non-Muslim organizations. The slides show you which organizations they were. And And we basically collectively went forth with this project. The themes that we covered in the 2016 research are on the screen. I won't read them out, but you can see them. Covered a range of topics. We developed the themes and the questions in close consultation with our partners, but we also had a group of advisors, people from Muslim organizations and academics and others who could provide us with some useful input on what we might look at in the research. Here's some details about the actual research. The survey of the Muslim population was conducted with a representative sample of 600 adults. We offered interviews in 4 languages. And this time we did an additional online survey with 300 Muslim youth. This was through funding provided by the Inspirit Foundation and allowed us to expand the research a bit further. I should point out at this point that as in 2006, the 2016 survey also included a companion survey of the non-Muslim population, of the rest of Canadians, because we wanted to get their perspective as well on Muslims in a way that was done in some other countries, as Sarah showed in her parts. So what I want to do now is to share just some selected highlights from the research. There is a full detailed report of this research available on our website, embryonics.institute.org. So there are a lot of details. If you're interested in learning more than what I'm going to cover today, I invite you to check that out. The first theme we looked at was personal connection to Canada. This is quite relevant because about 70% of the Muslim population in 2016 were immigrants, were first-generation Canadians. So belonging and connection to the country is something that's quite relevant. What we can see on the slide here to the left is that most Muslims in Canada feel connected to the country. 55% very strong, 39% generally strong. Very few would describe their connection as weak. And on the right side of this slide, you can see that the majority of the Muslims we surveyed say that their connection to the country or sense of belonging to the country has actually strengthened over the past 5 years. And very few say it has become weaker. Excuse me. The research found that 83% of Muslims say they're very proud to be Canadian. That's actually higher than people who are not Muslim by about 10 percentage points. And we asked Muslims who are very proud the source of their pride. In other words, what is it about Canada that makes them feel proud to be a Canadian? And the results to this question are open-ended in the sense that we did not offer these categories. These were the themes that came out of people's own words. And what we could see, and we could see the results for both surveys, is the top mentions are the fact that Canada is a free country, a democratic, multicultural society, peaceful, stable country, humanitarian people, and so forth. These themes are maybe not surprising themes, but it gives us a sense of where that pride comes from. I think what's interesting and what's not shown in the slide is that when you ask other types of Canadians the same question, you actually get pretty much the same types of answers. What about satisfaction with the direction of the country today? This is sort of one of our standard benchmark questions to get a sense of how people feel things are going. On the left, you can see that among Muslims, over 8 in 10 Muslims were satisfied with the direction of the country. From 2006 to 2016, it went up from 81 to 89%. There's some good reasons for that, which I won't cover today. And it shows by comparison, when you ask the rest of Canadians the same question at the same time, you get much lower numbers. Canadians are much less likely to feel that positive. There'll be a number of reasons for this. I think it's fair to say, and we know from other research, that immigrants tend to, in some ways, be more positive about Canada. They're less likely to take the country and what it has to offer for granted. So you tend to see these kinds of results with immigrants overall. Excuse me. Another theme that we looked at is Muslim identity and practice. We asked Muslims in our survey about important parts of their personal identity. And what we see is that 84% say being Muslim is very important. Almost as many say being Canadian is very important. And by comparison, this population is a little less likely to place that level of importance on their ethnic or cultural or national group. So there are some interesting differences here. We looked further at those who said being Muslim and being Canadian were both very important, and we pressed them a bit to find out which was more important. So a bit of a forced choice. We found for Muslims, which are the green bars, that when you push the issue, Muslims were more likely to say that religion was more important than being Canadian, although both were important. And other Canadians were a little more likely to say Canadian rather than religion. But it's interesting that about a quarter in both populations insisted that both were of equal importance. So it is interesting to understand the intersection of the different levels of identity and to keep this in mind. And it does have a bearing in some of the other results as well. We asked about attendance for prayers at mosques or Muslim community centers. And we can see this is data for both waves of the survey. A significant plurality say they attend prayers at least once a week, if not more often. And that plurality actually increased over the 10 years from 41 to 48%. Most frequent attendees, not surprisingly, are men. What's interesting, however, is that the frequency of attendance over the 10-year period increased most noticeably among the younger generation, aged 18 to 34. What's not shown on this slide is that about a quarter visit mosques for educational or socializing reasons. So that's also a reason to attend, but not quite as often. An open-ended question that we asked on the survey was about sources of guidance as a Muslim. Again, an open-ended question. 6 in 10 name at least one source, but 4 in 10 don't name any. So you can see the list of sources here, perhaps not too surprising, except perhaps the 42% that don't name any. This group, the none group, are a little more likely to be over 45 years of age, have spent less than 10 years in Canada, and of course, rarely or never attend the mosque for prayers. Let me turn now to the theme of integration into Canadian society. One of the big issues or concerns that some Canadians have about immigrants like Muslims is that they don't want to become Canadian. They don't want to integrate. They don't want to become part of the community. They want to remain in their own distinct communities and stick to themselves. And that is a concern for many people and something that has become an issue. So on this is a question that we asked Muslims in both surveys. And the question was not about themselves, but about what they thought their co-religionists wanted. And what we can see is that by a 2-to-1 margin, Muslims believe that other Muslims, or Muslims generally, do want to adopt the customs of Native Canadians, as opposed to wanting to remain distinct. And you can see that there are smaller proportions that either feel that both is equally the case or have some ambivalence or are not sure. And we can see there hasn't been a lot of change over the 10-year period. But how do other Canadians respond to the same question? Excuse me. And we get a very different response. We found, particularly in 2006, that most non-Muslims, the belief is that among most non-Muslims, that Muslims want to remain distinct as opposed to fitting in by a 2-to-1 margin. I think it's notable and I think a positive development that perception was not as strong in 2016 as it was in 2006. So this may well be the case that this is something where the broader population is coming to appreciate that Muslims coming to this country don't want to remain distinct. And we're hoping the next time we do this research that we will find further movement in the same direction. Another way to look at the issue of integration is to ask about the values that that immigrants should adopt when they come to Canada. So here's a question. Again, we asked it in an open-ended way. And the question is basically, what values are most important for immigrants to adopt when they come? And here we're showing results for Muslims and non-Muslims. And what's notable here are not the response categories, English or French language fluency, tolerance, respect for others, respect for history, respect for the law, but the fact that the Muslims and non-Muslims give largely the same response to the same question. So it really is a striking case of, if not consensus, broad agreement about what's important for immigrants, including Muslim immigrants, to consider when they come to this country. And I think this slide probably would surprise many non-Muslim Canadians who somehow have the view that Muslims are coming with a very different set of expectations when they arrive. One of the controversial issues we addressed in the survey is about wearing the niqab. As you know, this has been a flashpoint in Canada and some other Western countries. Here is data from both the Muslim and non-Muslim point of view. Over on the left, we asked about whether Muslims should be allowed to wear niqab while participating in citizenship ceremonies. Muslims clearly support rather than oppose this practice, although not entirely, whereas non-Muslims are more evenly divided on this. We also asked about wearing the niqab while receiving public services, which, as you know, has become an issue in Quebec. Again, most Muslims, a strong proportion by a 3-to-1 margin, support this, although not all. Non-Muslims also support this more than oppose it by not quite as much of the same margin. It's notable on this question that in Quebec, both Muslims and non-Muslims are less supportive than people in other parts of the country. So it is obviously more of an issue in that province, and a good reason why any research and understanding about the Muslim experience in Canada, one needs to look regionally and through other groups, not just the national picture. Another theme is about the treatment of Muslims in broader society. And we ask questions about what Canadian public opinion is about the religion of Islam. And if we start over on the left, we asked Muslims how they thought other Canadians thought of their religion. And what's interesting for both waves, that Muslims are more likely to say that other Canadians view Islam as positive rather than negative. And it's improved from 2006 to 2016. If we ask non-Muslims about their own opinion to really test that out, we find a result that's not dramatically different. In other words, non-Muslims are more likely than not to say they have a positive opinion of Islam, but not quite as strongly. And it's interesting, between 2006 and 2016, that neither category has kind of increased. The reason for that is not entirely clear, but nonetheless, there seems to be a little more ambivalence about it in 2016. We also asked a question of Muslims to compare the treatment of Muslims in Canada compared to how they believe Muslims are treated in other Western countries. And here you get a pretty clear result. A strong majority of Muslims in both surveys believe that Muslims in Canada fare better than they are in other countries, primarily Western Europe. And very few believe the treatment is worse or even the same. So here is a fairly favorable comparison. At the same time, this doesn't mean that Muslims feel that the treatment is necessarily positive. Excuse me. We asked people to identify what they consider to be the most important issues facing Muslims in their own local community today. And it's an open-ended question, so we did not prompt people with particular categories. And far and away, the issue that comes out most clearly is the treatment and discrimination of Muslims by the broader community. 35% mentioned this. No other issue is identified in this question by as much as 10%. So clearly this is something which is a reality. And of course, Sarah showed some results from other countries, and no surprise that it's an issue here. The value of this research, however, is to put numbers to it and to measure it in a more precise way. We asked a more specific question, whether you have experienced discrimination or unfair treatment by others in the past 5 years because of your religion, your ethnicity, your culture, your language, or your sex. And the results here are quite clear, but for any of the reasons, 35% of the Muslims we surveyed said yes, they have experienced this for one or more of these reasons. And you can see that primarily because of religion or ethnicity, culture, and less so because of language or sex. What's useful here is to compare it with the general population, because this question was also included in the General Social Survey in 2013. And what we can see, by no surprise, is that Canadians in general are noticeably less likely to experience any form of discrimination, especially because of religion. So this is quite clearly, shows clearly the difference in experience. The groups in the Muslim population most likely to report such discrimination include Canadians who are who are Canadian born, those who were born in African countries, women, and Quebecers. People reporting such discrimination were asked a second question about where such discrimination has taken place, in what settings. We provided this list, and what we could see that based on discrimination due to religion, you can see the workplace, public spaces, stores, banks, restaurants, schools, and so forth, public transit. That these are the settings most commonly where people experience this kind of treatment. A little bit different due to ethnicity and culture, but the pattern is not dramatically different. Something that's not on the slide, but which we asked another question is 25% of the Muslims we surveyed said that they have experienced difficulties crossing borders when they travel, and this is especially true for Canadian-born Muslims. Another impact of discrimination and Islamophobia is how one might censor oneself in public or in conversation with others. 1 in 6 Muslims said they felt the need to repress opinions about social and political issues because of who they are or their identity. So that's 17% you can see. You'll see that it's higher among younger Muslims and also among those who are Canadian born. And of course, those two groups overlap quite significantly. And then finally, looking forward, what will the next generation of Muslims face in terms of discrimination and stereotyping? If you look over to the left, you can see that there's differing opinions, but more likely to say that the next generation will face more than face less discrimination. And then over on the right, the proportion who say face more discrimination by age cohort shows quite clearly that younger Muslims are the least optimistic about the future. And of course, it's going to be their future that they're going to be dealing with. Ironically, it's Muslims in Quebec who tend to be the most optimistic. So that's enough highlights that I have time for, because I'm almost out of time. Let me just cover a few very brief takeaways or insights from the survey from 2016. I think what stands out is that Muslims are notably positive about the country and the acceptance of their religion, despite the ongoing reality of stereotyping and discrimination. I think that that's the rest of Canadians have to feel pretty fortunate about that. And most Muslims are as connected to the positive values associated with Canada and multiculturalism as any group in this country, which oftentimes does not fit the stereotype. Also, I think very valuable to see is that religious identity and practice are very important for Muslims, and it's growing rather than weakening, which is what you might expect among immigrants coming and assimilating into a country, and particularly a country that is largely secular and becoming more secular as over time. And finally, Muslim youth, are developing their own identity as Muslims excuse me, and as observant, if not more so, than their older generations. And they are the ones who are the least accepting of the status quo in terms of treatment by broader society. And this is actually a finding that we found with our research with other groups, including the Black community and Indigenous peoples, where we find a similar pattern. So this is all valuable insight from 2016 research, but it's now 2021. And this research and these insights are now 5 years old. So really what we're looking at, and what I'd like to talk, end briefly with, is to talk a bit about the research we'd like to do in 2022. And that is a new wave of this research. What our goal is to build on the previous surveys to update the trends and also explore some new topics. Again, populations, culture, politics, attitudes are in constant change. And what we found in 2016 may no longer be as applicable today. So as we go forth with planning the research, and Anver gave you a little sense of the timetable and so forth, is that we will be consulting with the community fairly broadly to get some valuable input with partners and others. We will time the survey, as Anver said, with the 2021 census. And we hope to expand the scope of the research to have a larger sample, up to 1,000 or more in our sample, so that we can do a better job of looking at the diversity of the population. To return very briefly to the timetable, this is how we see moving forward. And I just want to make a point about the 2021 census and why it's important. Why it's important is that in order to have a representative sample of Muslims in our survey, we have to have a very good fix on the actual population and demographics and distribution of Muslims in the country. We need to know how many and where they are and what their demographics are so that we can use that to build a sample. We simply can't do that with 2011 data at this point because, as I indicated earlier, the population is now twice as large. And finally, once we're finished with the research, this is not just intended to produce another report. MiCDI will have a postdoctoral fellow to support in-depth analysis and write various reports and other material for distribution. There will be a MiCDI data portal that will include a lot of information. And this information and the data and the research is all intended to be available to Muslim organizations and others, so it could be effectively used. And above and beyond that, it's certainly our intention to be out with community groups and policymakers and others to present the research and make sure that it is well known and well understood. So with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Anver.
Wonderful. Thank you, Keith. I really appreciate it. And so the queue is open for those who would like to ask any questions. We do have one question already, and I'll direct this to the team, although I think Keith might be in a particularly good position to answer this, given his work on the Jewish community in Canada. Someone asks if Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Hindus get asked if they feel more Canadian than feeling more Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, etc. And so is this a question that also is applied across the religious spectrum? Is it unique to surveys of Muslims or other racialized minority communities?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, we did ask that question in our survey of other Canadians. So we have, I don't have all the detailed results by group with me, but we do have that data. And I think from the general picture, the non-Muslims are less likely to identify religion as being Canadian. I think that's the quick answer. The breakdown by particular religious groups, we'd have to go into the data. And of course, our survey was not large enough to cover all of the different groups. Our institute has done a separate national survey of Jews in Canada, which is the first and only such survey that's been done. I don't believe we actually asked that same question in the same way. But so I think that it's probably more a question of asking uh, um, not so much which you identify as identity, but how important religion is to you in your life. And very briefly, most other religious groups from the data I've seen don't place as much significance on religion overall. But as we know, other religions have different denominations and affiliations. So for instance, among Jews in Canada, Jews who are Orthodox place considerable importance on religion, and Jews who are not even religious place much less. So I think it's difficult to actually generalize for other religions overall, and this requires a bit more nuance in terms of looking. But it's a very good question.
Thank you. The other question is, so the question in here, maybe I'll direct this one to Sarah, is Anahid asks, how do you consider the diversity within the Muslim community? Has it been done before? How might we do it going forward in a project like this, given the heterogeneity of the Muslim community?
Yeah, so taking an intersectional focus on understanding Muslim experiences as being diverse and not homogenous, that's actually one of my main aims in my own research. I'm guessing that Anahid might have missed the previous webinar. So I would recommend definitely checking out the previous webinar where I do go into the breakdowns of different experiences of different Muslims in Canada. I would also recommend checking out my 2019 report. So that gets into this a bit more as well. Generally, I would say that understanding the diversity, especially when it comes to gender differences, racial differences, and differences between immigrant and non-immigrant groups is really important to consider. And centering experiences of specific groups as well. For example, of Black Canadian Muslim women is very important in understanding the Muslim experience more generally in Canada.
Thank you so much. Nusat from Canadian Council of Muslim Women, one of the partner organizations within MiCDI, asks about other surveys that have been done on Muslims and attitudes towards them. The Association of Canadian Studies, she specifically mentions, and Ledger. Do you have any thoughts of those studies and relative to both what previous and Veronica's reports and what we're planning to do here going forward?
I'm aware of the work that the association has done with the general population, attitudes towards Muslims and Jews and other groups. I actually haven't seen any research that they've published with the Muslim community specifically. So I guess I'm not sure that they have done representative surveys of Muslims. It's not it's not an easy thing to do, and it's quite costly, but I would certainly be interested in learning more about that. Sarah, are you familiar with something else?
Not very much. Abdie, I feel like Abdie would be a good person to comment on this as well.
No, it's the same for me as well. I'm not very clear about whether they've done any specific survey or what their findings were.
I think just most of the other research in Canada has been asking the general public about groups, which of course is valuable. The part that's more unique and what hasn't been done is surveys with the populations in a way that's significant enough to be representative of the population, rather than what might sometimes be considered a convenient sample, where you might offer a survey to a community and invite whoever wants to participate to do so. That can be useful, but it's not representative of the population from which it's drawn. So there really is the need for more research with these communities.
There's a couple questions I want to pose to you both, to all of you, around some of the terms that we might throw around in the context of surveys. A couple of folks asked, what do when we're talking about things like Canadian customs or Canadian culture or experience discrimination, is there a consensus on what these terms mean, the academic formal definitions, and how do we integrate the whatever those definitions might be with the public's understanding of them? Are there nuances that that are necessarily conveyed in this survey, or that ought to be conveyed in future surveys?
Okay.
You want to start, Sarah? And then
Sure.
Go ahead.
So this kind of taps into the ideas of conceptualization and operationalization in survey research. So what you see on the slides isn't necessarily what's asked of the respondents. For example, when we talk about discrimination, we conceptualize that as being experiencing either bodily harm or verbal assault or some kind of unfair treatment. And then the way that that's operationalized is often respondents will be asked in the last 5 years, have you experienced verbal threats, physical harm, job loss, other forms of they'll avoid using the word discrimination directly, but then also include it as well, so that there is an indication of like what kinds of experiences the survey question is getting at. So it depends on how the survey team decides to operationalize these different concepts, but there usually is consensus around the way that they are operationalized in order to ensure that the surveys are comparable to each other.
I could just add to that, to what Sarah's saying. That's true in some cases. In other cases, you can't give specifics. What you're trying to do with survey questions, which is definitely an art form in and of itself, is to use terminology and language that's as vernacular as possible, terms and phrases and things that people will comprehend, or for which there may be some meaning because of their use broadly in society. And so sometimes you need to use some general terms, and you can't or don't necessarily want to give precise definitions, partly because when you're asking survey questions, you can't give too many details, and you can't risk being confusing. So you need to settle on language and terms that that are broadly understood and comprehensible, and try and capture concepts or ideas that people might be able to recognize or relate to. And how people interpret those, there's no way to know exactly how everybody will interpret those words. That's the aspect of it. However, if you're using the terms consistently across surveys, across populations and questions, then everybody's responding to the same thing. And sometimes you'll gain further insight through further questions. So sometimes you'll ask a question and then you'll ask a follow-up question, ask them what they meant. So the ways through it, but there is a challenge to doing this, but if you're using the terms sensibly and in a consistent way, it can work. And then of course, in the interpretation, you have to keep in mind what the words were when you're analyzing the results.
So I want to ask a question that also connects with Randy's question to the group. So we talk about a survey that will be designed relative to the StatCan census data. We talk about creating a sample model for making sure that those surveyed in the embryonic survey are representative. And Randy's concern around how would we integrate race in that conversation. So I'm wondering if just from an educational perspective, can you advise us, what does it mean to create that representative sample model, which then gets applied to the actual implementation of the survey? And what does that mean for categories like race, economics, gender, and so on?
Sarah, do you want me to take this? Okay, so we could have a whole webinar on this, but we won't here. The goal is to end up with a sample that's as representative as possible within the constraints of time and budget. And when Stats Canada does a census, they could spend multi-million dollars to interview everybody. And when they do one of their general social surveys, they also can spend quite a lot of money to interview, tens of thousands of respondents. For a survey like this, the approach, the census provides the population demographics and location of the Muslim community for that point in time. And that information then can be used to identify what the profile of a representative sample would look like across a whole number of dimensions. The process that usually is followed is that we will select a small number of those dimensions as the ones we consider to be most important and set quotas for those. So for instance, gender, age, region or location. We might or might not include education or race or something. And we determine that, that across those different dimensions, often interlocked, our sample should have a certain profile to it that matches the population. So when we're doing the interviews, we will make sure that we have a balance of men and women, of people across different age groups, of different regions and communities and so forth. And we will make sure that the sample in the end is conforms to or is close to those dimensions. So the profile is similar to that in the census. Now, it's not possible to do that with all the possible relevant dimensions. So race, for instance, which is relevant, race may be one that we will end up establishing quotas for, in which case we will do our best to represent that. But there's a finite number of dimensions that we can practically use in developing this kind of sample. So in the end, some of the dimensions which we pay attention to may not be quotas, but we may still want to have them reflected in the final data. So we may sort of weight the data, if you will, so that, for instance, if the race proportion of race is off a bit, we may adjust through weighting so that it's more in proportion to the actual population. However, the qualifier here is that for something like race, there may be a dozen relevant racial categories, but some of them may be so small in number that it's not practical to have enough representation from each one of those in our sample just because of the numbers. So they may be represented in our sample, but there may not be enough of a particular race for us to be able to speak about it in the analysis because it's such a small proportion of the population. So that's a very brief response. Sarah, do you want to add anything to that, or Abdi?
No, I think that was very thorough. Oh, Abdi's going to add something. I was just going to mention that an easy way to think about weighted data, if we think about the NHS, is like every individual is approximately worth about 32 people. But if there's a respondent from a category that is underrepresented in the data, they'll actually represent more individuals than just about 30. Abdi?
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate what Keith mentioned very sort of convincingly. So basically, weights are the way that these adjustments are made in the data. And if you look at any StatCan survey, you will see that there is a variable included there that is called exactly that weight. So basically, what it does is that it sort of artificially increases the size of certain groups and decreases the size of the other groups for the same reason that Keith mentioned. The important thing with the weights is that they have to be based on some criteria over which there are not a whole lot of disagreements. So we can, and that's why in most cases the weights are calculated based on some sort of demographic variables, gender, age, location of living, immigrant status, and stuff like that. If there is a variable that there are some controversies around in terms of how to define it, then the weights are not going to work very well for those. And that's why, as Keith mentioned, the number of variables that can be used for the weighting purposes are fairly limited.
Just one, thank you, Abdi. One final thing. I think that when we're designing the research and in consultation with partners and others, we'll be interested in what dimensions of the population are considered to be the most important. And that will be considered when we develop our sampling strategy. Amber?
So I want to ask you, someone asks about institutions. Are there surveys that write about Muslim institutions? Because I know that most of what we've been talking about are individuals subject to the census analysis. But what kind of work has been done on surveying Muslim institutions, representing them here in Canada?
As far as I know, I'm not familiar with any surveys that tackle this information. What I have seen are like individual studies. For example, Amir Hussein's study from 2000-2001, I think was the first that looked at Canadian Muslim institutions. And since then, there have been a handful, but it hasn't been surveyed as far as I know. Keith?
I'm not aware of any. Abdi, you might know. If anybody would know, it'd be Abdi.
So that is, there are a lot of interest in sort of surveying the Muslim organizations and sort of developing some understanding of the kind of services that they offer. It is not an easy thing to do, and it is a sort of totally different type of operation from the kind of surveys that we are talking about, because in those cases we are dealing with institutions, organizations, not individuals, and we have to find organizational information for them. So surveying all of these is not, because there is no place that they are all listed, and we cannot do sampling. Sampling is not going to be very effective in that kind of data generation. So I think it is a difficult thing. There are some efforts out there that have tried to capture this, but they are far from adequate.
I'm sorry, I'm having some video issues, but let me at least ask the question from Riaz to the data team. What is the benefit of a survey like this for Muslim community organizations and partners? Obviously for academics, this is the kind of thing that we do, but maybe you can give us a sense of what the Muslim community might be benefiting from.
So I'll jump in first.
Go ahead, Sarah, please.
So this kind of data is actually what Muslim organizations have been asking of the Institute of Islamic Studies for some time now. And so this is one of the reasons that we're wanting to commit to doing the survey. It can help in many, many different ways, from policies and programming and different community outreach efforts. I'll give you an example. The Canadian Muslim Vote partnered with us in 2019. They were present when we were developing the reports on data on Canadian Muslims. And one of the things that came out of there was the underrepresentation of voting among Black men who are Muslim. And one of the reasons we found of why Black Muslim men are not voting is because they're turned away at, they believe that they don't have proper identification in order to vote. And they were overrepresented in that respect compared to other groups. So the kinds of data that we're collecting is specifically in order to help Canadian Muslim organizations do the kinds of programming and efforts that they're wanting to do. I see Abdi also has his hand up, and Keith, you wanted to add something?
Abdi can go next.
Okay.
Yes, in addition to what Sarah mentioned, I will take just one example from what Keith presented just a minute ago about the gaps in the perceptions of Muslims about what Canadians think about them and the actual thinking of the non-Muslim Canadians. So imagine that there is a significant gap there. For example, Muslims think that the non-Muslim Canadians have a very positive view of Islam, but in reality, that is not the case. So that basically points to the fact that Muslims have a lot of work to do in terms of bridging that gap, in terms of filling that gap. So there might be a need for some sort of awareness campaigns, for example, about Islam or what Muslims do. And if there are some stereotypes and some misperceived concepts about Muslims, I think these are basically get highlighted in this kind of research, and it will show some directions for action and activities for Muslims. So this is just one example, but as Sarah mentioned, there are many, many more.
Yeah, and if I could just add a bit more to what they said, I think that it can be an effective way to demolish stereotypes, which may be out there, because there's some solid data. Groups may find this supports advocacy efforts for policy change and so forth, if there's data to support something. And I think one other point that's worth making, and this does not just apply to Muslims, but applies, I think, to Canadians overall. You know, in a way, as a country, we don't understand ourselves that well. We're a big country. We're all spread out. We're all have different kinds of identities and experiences and cities and so forth. And there's sometimes not a lot of opportunities to understand who we are and what we may have in common, because everybody is kind of limited to their own filters and their own experiences. And for a population like Muslims in Canada, it is a diverse population. It's not just a solitary block of individuals, which I think non-Muslims tend to assume it is. But I expect that many Muslims don't feel that they necessarily understand all the other Muslims and who they are and what's similar and what's different. And so this kind of research provides an opportunity for Muslim organizations and others and their constituents and so forth to get a better sense of what the Muslim experience is like, that's not limited to your own particular networks and sources of information. So it's not as if it supplants everything else, but it builds on and helps an understanding of what is similar and what's different.
Thank you, Keith, and I want to thank you all. I want to offer my thoughts on that same question, but from a directorial perspective. As a director of the Institute, it's been a journey to get to the stage we're at through a number of consultation meetings, not just with academics, but with community stakeholders and parties that have different demographics across Canada, different constituencies across Canada. One of the things that at the Institute we recognize is that there is a dominant story around Muslims in Canada, and it's not a very positive one. And so the question is, how do you tell stories? How do you retell new stories in different ways? And so on the one hand, you can tell stories through curating art. You can tell stories through pictures, through artifacts. But you can also tell stories through numbers. And the idea then is, how do you do that? What kind of work can we do with the Muslim community in that regard? How can we showcase that? And it's been wonderful for us to be able to integrate an academic research program with community partners interested in the very same sort of endeavor. So we're really fortunate with that. Obviously, the biggest challenge for us is funding a project, creating data. Well, it's one thing to study existing data. You just go and you study existing data. But what we're really talking about is creating data and creating sets of data that center Muslims in their analysis. And that takes some funding, that takes some effort. And that's what we're hoping we can generate interest in from our community partners and others. And so I believe that was the last question that I had. And so I want to thank you all for joining us today. We just got a few more minutes. So if you're interested in following up, feel free to contact us at the Institute at islamicstudies@utoronto.ca. We're happy to answer questions about MiCDI. If you're interested in getting involved, again, please feel free to reach out to us. And with that, I want to thank the data team, Keith and Sarah. Thank you for leading us in this session. Abdie, thank you for joining us as well. And to the rest of you who joined, our attendees, thank you for showing interest in this endeavor, and we look forward to keeping you abreast of new webinars that come out, extending the analysis, sharing it with you as well. So thank you very much.